good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. This is the fifth episode in our series of online workshops hosted by Digital HealthWorks. And today we're going to be talking about valuing investments in health technology. So I'm going to be your moderator today, and I'm joined by my colleague Daniel Young, and we have our guest speaker, John Schneider, with us today as well. So I'll be introducing them in a moment. Just to remind you on the format of these workshops, so we want this to be a relatively casual presentation. We're going to start off with about 15 minutes of a formal presentation, followed by a moderated discussion. So feel free to ask any questions along the way. You can type them into the chat, but at the end, you're very welcome to unmute yourselves, turn on your cameras, and actually join in to our discussion. So don't be shy. As a little overview, Digital HealthWorks is a commercialization agency for digital health and medtech ventures. So our mission is to bring amazing innovations to the US and European markets. We work with a lot of groundbreaking technologies that are united by their mutual struggle to align on the regulatory, the market access, and the sales strategies. So we have experts based out of Berlin, Boston, and Lisbon, and we work in those three core areas. So really regulatory, market access, and sales. So today, my name is Romy Benninga. I'm going to be the moderator. I'm a market access and medtech consultant with Digital HealthWorks. I've been in the medtech industry for the past 7 years, working in both R&D and commercialization roles. And I'm very happy to be talking to you today.
Great, Romy. And I'm Daniel Young. I'm actually the founder of Digital HealthWorks. And when we started the company, or I should say started the agency, really the mission was about trying to help ventures, maybe be startups or corporates that are in the medical space, in the medical technology space, be able to resolve issues having to do with regulatory, go-to-market strategies and commercialization. And so in the work that we're doing, we had the pleasure to meet John, who Romy will introduce in a second. But I'm really excited to hear him, have him as a guest today to present the topic at hand about, how do you value digital health startups? So with that, Romy, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So actually, John and I crossed paths a few years ago working on a health economics study for a diagnostic product I was working on. So over to you, John. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Romy, for the introduction, and thank you, Romy and Daniel, for inviting me today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic. So my background's in health economics, which I think probably most of you know what that is, but it generally means different things to different people. I think in the sort of outside of the U.S., health economics really means economic evaluation of new drugs, devices, and diagnostics and digital technologies applied to healthcare or health tech more generally. But in the United States, it means more broadly a subfield of economics that focuses on anything health related. So that's what I've been doing my whole career. I am the head of Avalon Health Economics and one of the founders of that company. And we, just as the name implies, we do primarily health economics, but our intended audience mainly, or sort of client base, is smaller biotech, medtech, diagnostics companies. Hence the engagement that Romy was referring to, where we crossed paths. And the conversations that I've had with Digital HealthWorks have been sort of along the lines of how do we serve that sort of market segment. So we've been doing mostly that work for those smaller companies. We do have some larger pharma type clients, but most of the time we're working with the smaller guys who have investment on their minds in terms of attracting it in rounds of fundraising, and then going forward, getting that additional capital via and some sort of exit strategy. And we're lurking in the background in all of that are the investors, and we don't, in the health economics world, we don't necessarily interact a lot with investors, but I think it's a very important topic I should say, not so much topic, but it's a very important message, I think, to get the health economics kind of thinking, at least from my perspective, health economics, market access, all these things that we deal with on a daily basis in the industry. Make sure that investors understand those issues too. I think a lot of them do, and a lot of you, I think, today on this presentation, or attending this presentation, are investors, and I think a lot of you guys do understand it, that stuff. But I think it's important to make sure you're aware of all the different things that are going on out there in terms of economic evaluation and market access that help kind of build out the story of value for a medtech company. So with
Great.
that, I will go. I'm sorry, go.
No, I was going to say, I'll stop sharing and let you pull up your slides so we can dig into it.
All right. So, well, before I get to that, let me just one more comment by way of introduction. I am not an investor. In fact, I'm generally not trusted to handle money. So I'm not somebody who is going to be talking today about what you should or shouldn't invest in, that kind of thing. So just wanted to put that out there. My focus, as I said, is on health economics, and so that's going to be kind of the angle that I'm coming from today. So let's start with just some basic numbers. So this is the global trends in venture capital funding of medtech. These data come from a Deloitte study from a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago or so. So they're fairly up to date. They don't capture deals that are sort of in the works at the time of the publication. Of course, they also caveat it with, they miss a lot of things, and so these are probably not really complete data, but it gives you some idea of the trends. So the compound annual growth rate in the sum of the deal value in millions is going up, but it looks like a pretty steep climb there. So that's encouraging. I mean, I think that's probably not so much a function of the sort of pool of venture capital as it is the increase in opportunities to invest in terms of novel interventions in the medtech space. Investor objectives, I mean, of course, there's many, but I think most, for the most part, investors are looking for either a short-term exit or a long-term exit. And these, it's not really that important to differentiate between these things, but I do think it's worth making a few notes about it. So in terms of short-term exit, the focus is really on, can you increase the pre-market valuation of a medtech company? And how do you do that? Well, it's really early clinical studies, getting those underway to the extent that they are necessary. These are mainly safety studies in the medtech world, but you could also be talking about some sort of small scale early efficacy study, estimating and simulating key parameters, and those are, we're going to get into that today. Like, it's really important to do the best you can to simulate how this technology is going to be adopted in the marketplace, and what resources might be saved by the use of this technology, and whether physicians will use the technology or whether consumers will use the technology. So there's a lot of factors here that can be, with modern sort of simulation model and statistical techniques, and we don't even need to go to AI. I mean, there's very relatively straightforward ways of doing these things that I'll talk a little bit about today. That even for the investor looking for short-term exit can sort of encourage a company to engage in. Of course, there's the standard tools to assess enterprise value. And those, the discounted cash flow and EBITDA multiples and things like that. those really, when you have a company that doesn't have any revenue and the EBITDA and the margins and everything look, weird because they're not actually building and selling anything yet. That you really have to simulate what is going to happen in the future. And again, there's ways of doing that that are pretty straightforward and don't require sort of a formalized AI kind of approach. When you're looking at long-term exit, you're focusing on usually the entire commercialization process. So you're thinking more about taking a company from its inception all the way to its selling products on the market. And that includes everything from the short-term exit strategy or exit thinking, plus the standard tools to assess enterprise value, this time based on actual market and actual sales, perhaps. So that's kind of a more, obviously, a longer time period and more involved process. So in terms of short-term exit, there's a couple things that I think are important. And let's start with just the clinical research. It's very important to clarify the product profile. So based on the design and the underlying science, what is this intervention supposed to do? There's a lot of, and I've seen this a lot in my career and at Avalon Health Economics, a lot of very cool devices, a lot of devices that make you, or more generally intervention. When I say devices, I'm just talking about any sort of intervention. And there's ones that make you think, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know we could do that. I didn't know we had the technology to do that. Or if you go to a trade conference, like AdvaMed, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of sometimes people will bring the device with them to the conference and show it to you. And it's cool. It's interesting. It's high tech. But is it, in spite of the best science, does it actually have a role in the clinical pathway? And one of the things that I think is probably a little bit underemphasized, and it shouldn't be, is the understanding the standard of care. So why are things being done the way they're doing? So the standard of care isn't just what's currently being done. It's asking the question, why are things being done that way? If the answer to the why things are being done that way is that, well, because we don't have a technological means of doing it a different way, then that's good, right? Then that means there's a sort of technological solution to this problem. If the why are we doing things that way is more complicated than that, it's patient preferences, physician preferences, coverage and reimbursement, blah, blah, blah. You go down the line, there's all kinds of reasons why we're doing it this way. Then you have to think a little bit differently. It's a different strategy. It doesn't mean you should just throw up your hands and give up, but it's a different strategy. So I think this understanding the standard of care is extremely important. And I've already alluded to this, establish the position in the clinical pathway. Very, very important. Conducting early clinical studies. Now, obviously with medical devices and health tech, it depends. The extent of a clinical study really depends a lot on the intervention itself and what kind of regulatory avenue you're going down. And but it is those types of studies, if they are necessary, are very important. And I put this in here, consider simulation and modeling of effectiveness trials. There are ways of doing that now. Again, I guess it would be considered AI at its inception of maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It was not really AI. It was just using advanced statistical techniques to simulate the outcome of a clinical trial, usually by taking a smaller sample and sort of simulating how that sample would inform a larger population. But that's something you all can look up on your own. I'm not sure if the prices of that kind of those kinds of simulation models have come down. I think they should, but I'm not sure that's happened yet. So they might still be just a big pharma thing. Economic research. So there's a lot of things that, I'm always surprised that some of the companies that come to us haven't done these things yet. Market size, market uptake. Market size is an obvious one. A lot of times the tendency is to just look at prevalence and say, well, if some disease has a 1.5% prevalence rate in the adult population, then now I know my sample size. Well, no, you really got to dig into that deeper than that in terms of those who seek treatment, those who are likely to get treatment. Adherence is an issue sometimes to adherence to treatment. So market size is not always a simple question. Market uptake's another thing. What's the competition look like out there, and how do we get people to use product A versus product B? That's something that usually is a marketing issue and not an economist issue. But when we do simulation models, like budget impact models, for example, we have to make some assumptions about market uptake. The general economic value propositions, conceptual value models, cost impact, budget impact models, these are all things that can be done very early on and should be done very early on. You don't, contrary to popular belief, you don't need fully worked out clinical studies in order to do economic models. You can do economic models based on the existing peer-reviewed literature in the context of a simulation model with sensitivity analysis in it. So if we're making up a parameter, which sometimes we have to do, we're going to say, well, this parameter is probably around 10%. Well, if there's some doubt about whether it's actually 10%, let's model it running between 1% and 20%. If we're very confident the actual parameter is somewhere between 1 and 20%, and we run a simulation model that covers that, we should be able to still have a simulation model with some meaning. Why do we care about a lot of this stuff? Well, at least here in the US, and I think that I've obviously looked at, I should have said before, we do work globally, so we look at things outside the US a lot too. But of course, in the US, things are always worse when it comes to healthcare. So one of the things that's worse is the total national health expenditures, which has been growing rapidly, and expenditures per capita has also been growing. So it's not just growing because of population; it's growing because of technological change, and in spite of the efforts of payers to sort of rein this in, it still continues to increase. So a lot of this is payers adding things to their portfolio that they pay for. So in your evidence of coverage that you get from a payer, it says that this payer is going to cover these things. Well, one of the things, like, let's say, is inpatient hospital care. Well, inpatient hospital care has changed technologically over the years, and so now there's more high-tech stuff happening during that stay, and so those costs go up, and hence this line goes up. So this is really what drives a lot of our thinking about economics, and in terms of how do we show value. This line's shown some elasticity over the years, if you will. It's as a society, or as individuals, we've allowed it to go from $2,000 per person to $14,000 per person. And it's a big increase that we've tolerated. And so we need to keep showing what we're getting for that. If you think about automobiles have gone up too, but the quality of a automobile now versus, my 1972 Oldsmobile Cutlass is astronomically different. The Cutlass may have had a bigger engine and have gone faster, but everything else about cars now is technologically way more advanced than that 1972 car. So from healthcare in 1970 versus healthcare now is obviously very much more advanced, even though we don't necessarily have the outcomes to show it. All right, so one of the things that I think is really important is these early stage sort of short-term exit type models, which can be done anytime, by the way. If you're investing in a company for a longer haul, there's no reason you can't do these things. And in fact, you should do these things, because the sooner you can get a handle on these things, the better. So what are they? Well, I'm a big advocate of conceptual models. So that seems obvious, right? Conceptual model is a logic model. It could be a flow chart. It could be a decision tree. Well, everybody should do those, right? The problem is people do them on the back of an envelope or the back of a napkin, and they never really work it out fully. I've seen some companies do a nice job of this, but a lot of them kind of just jump to the next step and don't dwell on this. I think what's really important is to lay out the logic and then have an advisory board type meeting. Not necessarily your company board, but bring in some experts from the field, bring in some experts from, especially from the clinical front lines, and talk about the intervention, and show them your sort of value diagram, or whatever you want to call it, your conceptual model of how this thing is going to work in practice, and see whether they agree with that. Again, it sounds obvious, but it's not always happening in a very systematic way. The next thing I really like are cost of illness studies. These studies, go out and figure out what is the value. What is the cost of a particular illness, and specifically, what most of these studies get at is what is the excess cost of a particular illness, and that's the key, right? So, because an intervention, it should really be addressing that excess cost. So it doesn't necessarily have to change the sort of core foundational costs, but whatever excess costs are in there, in other words, money that could be saved, that's really what you're going after. And so a cost of illness study can get at that. It doesn't tell you specifically where things can be saved, but if you disaggregate the categories in a cost of illness study, you can see where some savings might be achievable. And that's very important, to especially, if you go down the list here and do all three of these things, you're going to have a really nice, strong clinical story. Economic story. So lastly, these cost benefit models. Again, we're in the topic of short-term models. Cost benefit models, cost impact models, call them what you will. ROI models can be return on investment type outcomes that come out of these studies. These are studies that, everything's in dollar terms, so we're not getting into cost effectiveness yet. And we're looking really specifically toward realistically what could be saved. And I use this term durable savings. Durable savings means not a one-off savings. So the problem with some technologies, and we see this a lot in diagnostics, for example, is there's going to be a one-off savings. You're going to do the diagnostic, you're going to figure out what how the clinical pathway changes because of the diagnostic, and then you're done. It's really important to think about durable savings. In other words, even with a diagnostic, if you alter the clinical pathway early, how does that change the whole rest of the pathway? So if you think of it as a Markov model with processes, how does that change, transition probabilities, disease progression, all of that? You need to look at that. If the answer is it doesn't, then you're really just looking at one-off savings. That's a very different story than these sort of durable savings. Value-based pricing is something you've all heard about. It may not be always clear what it means, but you've got expected. What is a value-based price? I'm going to put it in real simple terms right here on this slide. You've got an expected marginal cost of producing the intervention, whatever that is. And it could be a service too. It doesn't have to be a thing, but a marginal cost. Marginal cost usually for the non-economists in the group, that's the least amount of money it takes to produce something. It's usually lower than the average cost, which is the total cost divided by the number of units that you produce. So we've got your marginal cost is kind of considered your floor. You can never price below marginal cost, otherwise you will straight up lose money. And then you've got your expected reimbursement R. You've got your expected savings per episode S, which we've derived from these other studies, especially cost impact studies. And now you're trying to think about, okay, how does this relate to price? Well, a value-based price is one that falls, somewhere between the marginal costs and the total savings. So you've got and then you've got a reimbursement rate that usually falls between a marginal cost and a value-based price. So the value-based price can put you above the reimbursement rate, but it should be below the amount that you think you're going to save, because you need to share that savings with the payer. So this is just an example of a conceptual model. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide. This is kind of this is an actual conceptual model that we've done, where we've showed, the green is just where dollar signs occur, the red is where outcome outcomes improve. And we've got each line here in a conceptual model we kind of think about as being something that we need to model. So if there's a connection between, the intervention and a particular outcome, that needs to be modeled somewhere in the model. So the conceptual model sort of helps us keep track of the relationships that we need to capture in the model. Cost impact models can be very simple. This one that we did on a point of care test in the UK was something that was, an extremely simple model. We do a point of care test for viral versus bacterial conjunctivitis, and we see sort of how that plays out in terms of changes in costs. This is more of a one-off kind of thing, not so much a durable savings thing, but very short time frame captured in the study, but still I think a very useful, valuable, sort of quick analysis. Cost of illness studies can be very involved. Like this one, this is not one that we did, but this is, economic burden of cancer in the US, estimate projections and future research. Depending on the level of disaggregation in a study, you can get a lot of detail even from a study like this. So what this is obviously excessively broad, but if it was economic burden of pancreatic cancer in the US, then we might be able to look at the disaggregations within pancreatic cancer, and you'll see hospitalizations and chemotherapy and things like that, and we can think about how those things might be impacted by whatever intervention you're working on. Value-based pricing. So I had that simple formula before with marginal cost on one end and savings on the other. Another way to look at it is this diagram, which is by Gregson et al. And this, I like the way these guys kind of laid this out, because you're looking at, sort of the market pushing down on prices, the company trying to say, hey, we deserve a higher price. And then in the middle is that value-based range. And you're not going to get to that value-based range unless you can really prove savings. And from an investment point of view, you're not proving it to anyone except yourselves and your investors. You don't have to go to market with that yet. But that's the time to really pressure test that value story. Long-term exit is really not that different. I'll highlight a couple of differences here. So, yeah, again, there's this, I think, strong importance on clarifying the product profile and understanding the standard of care. I think those things are the same whether you're looking short-term or long-term. In terms of conducting studies, longer term, usually you're going to have some sort of efficacy study. Again, it doesn't, in the med tech world, it doesn't have to be, it's not the same as pharma, so you don't have to have massive study going on over a long period of time with long-term follow-up. There's ways of doing studies more efficiently. In fact, I was talking to Romy and Daniel before this talk, and we were thinking that that could be a good topic for a future discussion, because I think there's clinical trials are something that I think I've seen our clients at least get tripped up on this in terms of they don't want to spend the money, and I get that. They're very expensive. However, they need something to hang their hat on that shows clinical sort of performance. I think there's a whole area here of how do you, what's sort of a cost-effective way of getting clinical trial information. One of the things you can do initially is look at a predicate device or intervention. And when I say predicate, you may not think it's a predicate, but maybe the outside world does. In other words, you might think, oh no, our device is very different than that, or our device is much better than that. But look and see what kind of clinical outcomes there are in your space that you're going into. And if those clinical outcomes are very durable and very relatively substantial, then the chances are good you're going to achieve the same or better outcomes. And there might be some ways you can make that case just using excuse me, just using existing literature. So the only thing that really changes over here in terms of economic research is we've added a couple things here. Budget impact models, which we didn't talk about before, and cost effectiveness modeling. And it's also, longer term, it's also easier to do coverage and reimbursement scenarios that are a little bit more realistic because you might have you just have a better idea of where you're coming in and maybe where the regulators are going to be at as well. So cost effectiveness modeling and budget impact modeling are the things that I'm going to talk about next. So budget impact analysis. This is something that is required. Actually, both of these, budget impact and cost effectiveness, are required by UK NICE, for example. You're going to have to do both of these to get market access over there in the UK. And some of the other European countries are going to require some version of perhaps of cost effectiveness analysis and potentially also a budget impact analysis. In the US, it is recommended by AMCP that thanks. It's recommended by AMCP that you conduct a budget impact model, but it's not necessary. So, in the US, you don't have to do anything. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's still very important, I think, to do as much of this as you can, even though it's not required in the US per se. Budget impact models are looking at the per member per month impact. So it's really focused on you're simulating a payer budget, and you're looking to see what is the per member per month impact on that budget of the adoption of the intervention. Some budget impact models are super simple. All you're doing is just modeling displacement. So how much of the standard of care is getting displaced by the intervention? This goes back to what I was saying before about how important that standard of care issue is. And it cost the budget impact model, again, is still comparative. So you're still looking at what is the budget impact of this intervention given the standard of care. So in a way, you're comparing to the standard of care, although you're getting this sort of one number, which is the incremental, the added PMPM cost of the intervention. The problem, the limit with budget impact model, with budget impact analysis, is that you're getting to the point now where you're simulating market entry, and at the very early stages of developing an innovation, you may not be able to really accurately portray that, especially if you're several years away from market entry. You don't even know what the market's going to look like at that time. So budget impact models are kind of I think of less value until you're closer to hitting the market. Cost effectiveness analysis, in contrast, are often associated with longer term models, more in-depth models, longer term exit strategies, and so forth. However, they can be done early, and they can be done, I think, quite accurately at early stages. In terms of publications, you might want to wait until you have some clinical data or something to publish a cost effectiveness analysis, but there's no reason one can't be done in-house and used in-house alongside a budget or a cost impact model or your cost of illness study or whatever it is, the other bits of evidence that you have. So the difference with a cost effectiveness analysis is it focuses on cost per quality adjusted life year. And the advantage of that is that it gives everything a common denominator. So, and also it means that you don't have to value health outcomes in dollar terms. We leave them in the form of a quality adjusted life year. So life year captures survival benefits. Quality adjustment captures, just like it says, quality of life using standard quality of life measures like EQ5D. So the thing about cost effectiveness analysis is that we have to have some willingness to pay threshold to compare it against. So we get what's called an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which is the sort of, think of it as like the first derivative in calculus, where you're looking at the difference in costs and the difference in quality adjusted life years between the intervention and the standard of care. This gives you this incremental incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or an ICER. And that's going to be just one number. So it's going to be 35,000 or 100,000 or something like that. And these in Europe, generally, although there's lots of exceptions to this, the willingness to pay thresholds around 35,000 US. In the US, we don't have a requirement for cost effectiveness. So a lot of things get approved and covered without knowing the cost effectiveness. But some enterprising academics have gone back and sort of figured out ex post what the willingness to pay the implied willingness to pay threshold was for those interventions, and it's much higher in the U.S. as you would expect, 100,000 to 150,000 per quality adjusted incremental quality adjusted life year. So this is interesting. It's not necessarily something I would encourage people to get hung up on early on. Don't start targeting a particular ICER when you're in the early stages of development. It's just not going to be beneficial. However, getting a sense of where you come in on this, if it's the case that no matter how you work it, you're coming out with 200,000, an ICER of 200,000 or something like that, you're going to be well over the willingness to pay thresholds for Europe, and specifically for UK NICE. It's going to be very difficult for you to get market access there with an ICER that high, unless you're in a rare disease market, or you have some other sort of extenuating circumstance that argument that you can make. But so it's really useful, especially if you're looking at both markets, to get a sense of that. In the US, well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. But really quickly, we have this thing called a cost effectiveness quadrant. It enables us to look to see how interventions are classified. So if something, you really just kind of want to be up here somewhere, which is the new treatment is more effective and it's a little bit more costly. I mean, you want it to be more costly because you want that value-based price in there. But that puts you up in this northeast quadrant. That's usually where you want to be. Obviously, it's great to be down here too, which is more effective and less costly. And some interventions that we've worked on certainly do fall down there, but you don't want to be anywhere over here. In the publication world, so looking at PubMed or something like that, so globally, a number of cost effectiveness studies wherein the healthcare sector or the payer sector has been the target instead of society has gone up in recent years. Since about 2007, you see it going up. So and then the orange line here is total number of cost effectiveness studies. That has gone up a lot as well. So there's more and more literature out there on cost effectiveness, more and more embracing of it, more and more accepting of it. A couple of really quick comments, and then I'll stop. We need to encourage these are sort of investment strategies that and by the way, as you can see, my perspective is both sort of speaking to the medtech developer and the investor. They need to sort of be on the same page with a lot of these things. So I'm not focusing on one versus the other. Encourage early but rigorous value-based studies. Kind of been emphasizing that all along, including transparent literature-based cost impact simulation models. I think transparency is key. People think you're trying to cook the numbers a little bit, then that's going to be a problem. Consider economic outcomes when planning safety studies, and later when you're planning your efficacy studies, think about, is there some economic outcome that you should be trying to capture in your studies? As I said before, leverage data from published studies, including public databases, relatively inexpensive private databases, and then before or alongside conducting de novo studies. There's a lot out there now that doesn't cost a lot of money, and think about how to leverage that to its full extent. Engage early with regulatory and policy impacting bodies like the FDA, CMS, AMA here in the US, and the equivalent agencies in Europe understand market access and landscape and develop an evidence timeline. There's, a lot of these agencies will have pathways for informal conversations, and I think it's really important to get those started as soon as possible. All right, I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much, John, for the really insightful comments. I think just reiterating the value of having these kind of studies from a very early stage. We see a lot of very early stage startups who don't realize that they're able to run these kind of models and extrapolate data and still have a very robust, a health economic model very early on before even any clinical data is available. So I think that's really important, not only from the startups who are looking to create more value for their company, but also for investors who are looking to try and understand what the value of a specific company is, to be able to ask those questions and understand if the founders and if the team are looking into those sort of studies. So thank you very much for that talk. Daniel, do you have any comments?
Yeah. Actually, I've got a bunch of questions that I wanted to throw out for discussion. But first, before I dive in, I wanted to give anybody who's participating a chance if they wanted to unmute themselves and ask any questions. All right. If you do, please raise your hand, and we'll definitely make space for you. But in the next few minutes that we've got left, John, there's a lot to really understand. And if we're looking at this from the perspective of considering making an investment into a startup, there are ones that are at early stages that really are still, in the process of developing their product. So it's a bit malleable. How can you put together some value models around those? What would be your first thing to do if you were working with an investor or a VC fund or a fund or something like that, to really start to go, these are the tools that you can use yourself to start doing preliminary evaluations on what a potential value, what you might be looking at from the perspective of establishing a value case?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Daniel. And I would say go back up to here. I think that these would be the three that I would choose from. And I'd want to maybe do a simple version of all three of these. So, the first thing here is conceptual model. So what is it how do you think the world works with the device or the intervention that you're developing? How do you think it works? And it's a logic model. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to hang numbers on everything. But start with that. And then the cost of illness kind of approach is, how much money can be saved out there? How much more are we spending? How much excess spending is there in that space that we might be able to have an impact on? And then finally, the cost impact models, including maybe some sort of value-based pricing type model, if assuming there's some sort of savings. I think that's something you can do. There's different versions of these things, Daniel. And I think I probably should have made that point initially, that you can do an early version of all three of these, and then you could do, and then you could sort of keep revising them as you go, as you get more and more information. And a lot of the times here with the cost impact models, we will end up publishing the cost impact model that was used by the developer from a very early stage.
Okay. So can you walk us through an example? Maybe try to give us a real world anecdote about how you've been able to determine an illness study, a cost of illness study.
Yeah, sure. So for example, right now we're working with a client to using Medicare data to figure out the total costs of peripheral neuropathy in the Medicare population. And one of the things with Medicare data, which by the way is not very expensive, Medicare is the U.S. program that covers over age 65. You can get Medicare data relatively cheaply at a 5% sample level, but that's still a huge number of people in it. And so we're looking to see how much, or we're looking to see what are the drivers of that cost difference between somebody who, is sort of a match case control kind of design, somebody who doesn't have peripheral neuropathy and somebody who does, controlling for all the other differences between these individuals. What the one who has peripheral neuropathy, do they have higher costs? And if so, what are the drivers of those higher costs? And we're able to nail down for the client the specific cost bucket that they think they're going to impact. They're very early on in development, that they think they can impact a particular category of costs, and we are helping them identify the magnitude of that cost in the Medicare population.
Okay, now that seems like it's theoretical and it's more like a macro level kind of valuation on what they're doing. But how can we personalize it more for a company? Are there tools that are a second layer of evaluation that you could look at a startup venture, for example, and try to say, well, this is what you might be able to achieve, or basically so that it's not so like abstract. I mean, even though you're definitely not beyond abstract and very specific with this, but I'm thinking about the use case about if I'm trying to evaluate if a company really has not just the team has potential to execute on it, but if they do execute on it, what's a realistic, achievable amount that they could expect to generate in revenues from an innovation or an intervention?
Yeah, I mean that's the key question, right? I mean, I think that's the operative question that I hope everyone is asking, and there's no real good magic bullet for that. Like I think you need to do, I mean, basically some sort of simulation of the real world using published data is probably the best like immediate thing that you can do, and it doesn't. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the Medicare data. I mean, usually at that point, you kind of already have an idea of what you're going after. I think before that, you need to really, keep costs down, focus on the published literature, and focus on gaps. Where is their gap? Where is their excess cost? Where are there areas in which physicians, payers, healthcare leaders have complained about rising costs, or and then which categories of costs are rising the fastest?
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Speaking of that, this is a couple more questions here. But you have under the cost impact models here on the screen. You introduce the idea of value-based pricing or value-based billing, and I know that that's kind of especially in the U.S., it's more of a hotter topic lately than it's been in the past, so to speak. But my observations have been that it's still kind of a soft it's a soft thing to look at, because how do you establish what a positive outcome for a patient? How do you build like a model that can measure the value that's being delivered? Have you you put something in there? But if you could talk us through that a little bit, that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's another good question. So, yeah, how do you capture value? I mean, I think that's if you think about the sort of the tools that have been developed and used globally are really cost effectiveness analysis, but cost effectiveness analysis relies on, it has to be a, commonly used, validated, sort of generalizable quality measure, health related quality of life measure like EQ5D or SF36. And if you're using those types of measures, invariably you're not capturing a lot of the action in terms of specifically how an intervention might impact somebody's life. So there are other tools out there that are less generalized and more focused on specific areas, like kidney disease or heart failure or whatever it is, and you can use those tools to get a better sense of what's going on out there. You can use sometimes registry data too, that has usually, maybe some different types of tools collected, different types of quality measures collected. But you do have to be a little bit creative in that regard. And the thing is, you have to divorce yourself from the endpoint. If you are eventually going to be submitting to, say, UK reimbursement authorities, yes, there are many rules that you're going to have to follow, and you don't want to go down the path of doing something, that then later is not acceptable to a health technology assessment agency. So you got to be careful about that. However, that doesn't mean you can't do your own things in-house to inform your own stories and to attract investment and then in terms of US payers, they're much more open to things too. So in the US market, you're going to have more flexibility, but tailored, for example, we worked on another project recently where we're looking at a drug that potentially reduces car crashes, makes drivers more alert. So the quality base of that model is the sort of quality of life kind of, or not the quality, but I would say the value base of that model is in avoided crashes, which is not something that you typically see in economic models, yet it's an actual that's a real outcome. I mean, it has a real cost associated with it. So that's the kind of thing. You have to be creative, you have to be open-minded, and you have to cast a wide net and think about what are all the different things that could be impacted.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to kind of revisiting something that you said earlier about pressure testing. You made a comment earlier about pressure testing the value story for intervention, if you would. But if you're looking at this from somebody who's considering making an investment into a startup venture, are there methods or ways that you could do that kind of from the outside? That you could try to evaluate what a company's going to be doing. Maybe the company didn't do a good job of doing it themselves, but you wanted to just double check it and confirm that there's really as value within the technology, assuming that they can execute on it. Can you walk through like some possible ways of going about doing that? Maybe some methodology questions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important thing is sensitivity analysis. So if you've worked out, you're pretty sure that you can avoid a hospitalization with a particular device or avoid a hospital readmission or something like that. Then I think one of the most important things you can do is a simple model that has a lot of sensitivity analysis in it. So let's think, best case scenario, worst case scenario, different use case scenarios, different adherence scenarios. And that's really what I mean by pressure testing is you're just throwing all these different scenarios out there and trying to find where the kinks are in the armor. So trying to find out where does this thing fail? Like, where does it not offer value? And that's fine. There's going to be areas in which you're not going to offer value. But then those are the areas you don't want to focus on. Unless you want to change unless you want to go back to engineering and have a conversation about changing the product. But if you kind of know what your product is going to do, and there's some areas in which you're not going to have much impact, just stay away from those areas. Focus on the areas in which you're going to have the highest impact. And I think simulation models with rigorous sensitivity analysis are the way to go.
Cool.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time now, so John, I think we could wrap it up a little bit, but definitely thank you very much for your participation in today's workshop. I know that we're covering a really complex topic, and just for the benefit of those that are on, I'm coming back from a radiology AI summit, and the topic of how to value the impact of an AI model in the healthcare system and where to find its place in the care path was basically 3 days of content about it. So there's a lot of what John said that frankly, would have bolted on to these kinds of discussions, but it's a real, in my mind, these kinds of analysis are almost as important as doing some clinical validation study, because if you don't have evidence going into a market that your innovation can really make a difference and quantify that difference, then you're going to have a tough time really making a compelling story to payers, providers, and especially people that are looking to make an investment in there. So I definitely think that there's different levels that startups have to do, but they really do need to be more aware of what goes into a study and try to commission it as best they can with the resources they've got, but demonstrate, in ways that you very well described, how they're going to make a positive impact and deliver value to the healthcare ecosystem. So, John, thank you very much. It was a great call. And for those of you who are on here, we're gonna recompile this as a video and post it online soon. So we'll send you a link so that you can watch it again if you need to, or share it with your colleagues. But with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank everybody for a great day. And if any questions come up, feel free to email Romy or myself, and we'll be happy to dive in and address them.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Take care.